I didn't want to do this. I don't like to chase current events, but in this particular case, I felt I had no choice.
Muy buenas noches a todos y todas. Este mensaje va
For those not aware,
principalmente
Mexico now
de
has a
Yucatán.
Jewish president.
Como saben, el
And if you
huracán
haven't heard about
Milton
this,
ya
there are
está
probably
bloqueando.
two main reasons.
Me informa
Foreign coverage of Mexico's internal affairs, especially in mainstream English language outlets, is just shockingly bad, though the exact reasons why are beyond the scope of this video. Insofar as the English-speaking world has taken notice of Claudia Sheinbaum's milestone as her country's first Jewish leader, the response has been embarrassing. Following Sheinbaum's election on the 2nd of June, both Melissa Weiss of Jewish Insider and Todd Richman of the Democratic Majority for Israel published tweets denying Sheinbaum's Jewishness on the grounds that she had thanked Jesus for her victory. She had in fact thanked her husband, Jesus. Alerted to the significance of Sheinbaum's Jewishness in the stupidest way possible, US media began pontificating about why this wasn't a bigger deal. The most obvious answer is that Sheinbaum's achievement as Mexico's first Jewish president has been overshadowed by her achievement as the country's first woman president, which has similarly blindsided the foreign press, despite the fact that Sheinbaum's victory was a well-anticipated landslide, that she received the most votes of any presidential candidate in Mexican history, and that both major candidates in the election were women. I'm from the United States, which has never had a woman president, but the idea that a woman could be president is completely normalized, at least for people under the age of 60, and Mexico is no different. You'd almost think that the Anglosphere's shock over Sheinbaum's victory is rooted in shallow stereotypes from 100 years ago. I'm just kidding. It absolutely is. In an effort to make sense of the non-issue of Sheinbaum's Jewishness, Simone Romero and Natalie Kitroff of the New York Times made note of her culturally Jewish but irreligious upbringing, her personal feelings of alienation from Mexico's Jewish community, most of whom voted against her, the rise of a far-right birther conspiracy theory trying to discredit her, and a religiously based insult by her opponent, vaulting to the conclusion that Mexican society is just so Catholic that she had no choice but to downplay her Jewishness. Never mind that secularism has been a norm in the Jewish world for over a century, or that anti-Semites have never cared how Jewish you are. The writers of this article live and work in Mexico City and are clearly familiar with Sheinbaum, the Jewish community, and the nuances of Jewish identity. So to conclude that she wouldn't be accepted in Mexican politics because of Catholicism is just so fantastically condescending and outdated that I had to go down there and set the record straight. So, here we are.
Mexicanas, mexicanos, ¡viva la independencia!
With me, you'll be free. With me, you'll be free.
Out with me, you'll be free. With me,
You'll be born.
Quisiera un dedo de salmón sin pepino, por favor.
Come with me, you'll be free. With me, you'll be free. Come with me.
Sí, puedo pedir para llevar un sándwich Rubén y una coca regular en botella.
Yep, that is definitely a small grasshopper. I don't hate it, but it's not really my taste. So now we know. If you've heard anything about the Jewish history of Mexico before now, it's probably about the very earliest and least reliably documented period of that history. And what you heard was probably wrong. In 1492, just before the first Columbus expedition, King Fernando of Aragon and Queen Isabel of Castile issued the Alhambra Decree, ordering all Jews under their rule to convert to Catholicism or be expelled. About 3/4 of the Jewish population chose to leave, while about 1/4 converted. In the following decade, those conversos were subjected to frequent scrutiny and occasional trial from the infamous Spanish Inquisition in a period which overlapped with the bulk of Spanish conquests in the New World. Indeed, some of the earliest Spaniards to arrive in the Americas were conversos. All conversos were ordered to leave the colonies in 1523. And in 1571, the Mexican Inquisition was established and began making records of accused crypto-Jews. In the 1960s, Mexico's National Archives began opening these records to the public, which, taken at face value, provoked a burst of interest in the idea of a major crypto-Jewish presence which has continued to be fueled by the advent of DNA testing and, allegedly, a fair amount of academic fraud. I'll leave those details to the YouTubers who talk about genealogy and keep things simple. First, Jewish ancestry doesn't imply crypto-Judaism. Most Europeans have some Jewish ancestry, but it's for the same reasons most Europeans are descended from Charlemagne. Conversos were a much more specific category. Furthermore, conversos aren't synonymous with crypto-Jews. Under the Alhambra decree, most Jews under the Spanish crowns chose expulsion over conversion. Most who stayed behind fully embraced Catholicism, and by the time of the Mexican Inquisition, crypto-Judaism in Spain was almost certainly extinct. On top of that, descendants of recent Jewish converts still required individual permission from the Crown of Castile to settle in the colonies. Second, Inquisition records are famously untrustworthy. As soon as it was established, the Mexican Inquisition began investigating alleged crypto-Judaism, but unlike in Spain, there are no surviving accounts with which to corroborate or dispute them. As in Spain, purported instances of Jewish customs were rarely distinguishable from more general Spanish customs. Accusations of Judaizing were often made against Protestants, liberals, and other dissidents, and accordingly these accusations often belied much stronger political and economic motives. Infamously, crypto-Judaism was one of many charges levied against the Catholic priest and revolutionary Miguel Hidalgo in the mistaken belief that his execution would end the Mexican independence movement. On the other hand, there is evidence of a Jewish presence in New Spain. Archaeological finds from the mid-16th century are extremely scarce but do exist, and by far the most suggestive evidence comes from the period between 1580 and 1640, during the personal union between Spain and Portugal. Unlike in Castile and Aragon, the Jews of Portugal had been converted by force, with no option to leave. As such, crypto-Judaism in Portugal was far more persistent and continued in isolated pockets right up to the 20th century. Of those crypto-Jews who fled Portugal, the vast majority sought out more openly tolerant societies like England, the Netherlands, or India. New Spain, by contrast, had little to offer. But even if the vast majority of accusations by the Mexican Inquisition were false, it's notable that accusations peaked during the Iberian Union. By far the most famous case is that against Luis de Carvajal, the first governor of Nuevo León. A native of Portugal, in 1579, Carvajal obtained permission from the crown to settle his extended family in the newly conquered territory, only to discover that said extended family were crypto-Jews, with his sister Mariana as their matriarch. Carvajal subsequently turned Mariana over to the Inquisition, who burned her at the stake. However, and in case you didn't hate him enough, Carvajal likely used his position as governor of Nuevo León to carry out large-scale operations to enslave the indigenous population, which was not only illegal, but a major obstacle to a peaceful resolution in the ongoing Chichimeca War. Correctly fearing that the slavery charges wouldn't stick, the Inquisition also indicted Carvajal as a crypto-Jew himself, since it required basically no burden of proof. He was convicted, but died before serving his formal sentence, leading to a common misconception that he really was a crypto-Jew, though the consensus among historians today is that he wasn't. As an interesting side note, while Jews weren't technically welcome in New Spain, and the Inquisition regarded crypto-Jews as criminals, being Jewish in itself wasn't technically illegal. The actual crime in question was apostasy, so in theory, an open, unbaptized Jew would have gone free. Of course, by the time Mexico had an open Jewish community, the Inquisition was a rapidly fading memory. In 1810, with Spain mired in the Napoleonic Wars and an accompanying crisis of political legitimacy, the aforementioned Father Hidalgo and several other politicians initiated a 12-year campaign for Mexican independence. In 1820, the rebel government abolished the Inquisition. In late 1821, independence was firmly secured. In 1823, the short-lived Mexican Empire was overthrown in favor of a republic, and sometime around 1825, the first Jewish immigrants arrived in Mexico City. Barely. Inquisition or no, the 1824 Constitution still maintained Catholicism as the state religion and banned the practice of any other. Even if it hadn't, Mexico in the mid-19th century was extremely unstable and not terribly appealing to prospective immigrants. Over the next 33 years, Mexico experienced a Spanish attempt at reconquest, numerous coups and regional rebellions, decades of wars against the Comanche, Apache, Yaqui, and Maya, a French naval blockade, independence movements in Texas, California, and the Yucatan, a single incompetent dictator somehow coming to power on 11 separate occasions, a U.S. invasion leading to the cession of Alta California and New Mexico, a series of invasions by American and French adventurers trying to start their own countries, and a revolution followed by a prolonged constitutional crisis. But in 1857, with Santa Anna fully out of their system, the liberal government that had overthrown him established a new constitution which opened citizenship to non-Catholics, though the free exercise of religion remained ambiguous. Is this the moment that Mexico's Jewish community truly came into its own? No. But also yes, but also no. Conservatives refused to recognize the new constitution and initiated a civil war, which the liberals quickly won. But the victory was short-lived. In 1861, Emperor Napoleon III of France took advantage of the United States Civil War by invading Mexico under the flimsy pretext of collecting Mexican debts, resuscitating the defeated conservatives to install the Austrian Maximilian von Habsburg as emperor. So imagine the conservatives' surprise when Maximilian not only upheld the 1857 Constitution, but continued the process of liberalization, including an 1865 decree unambiguously affirming freedom of religion. And though the French ultimately lost that war and Maximilian was executed, the victorious Republicans ended up making a similar amendment to the Constitution. In spite of all this, the Jewish Chronicle in 1862 reported a total Mexican Jewish population of only 100, and by 1900 this had only risen to about 1,000. Beginning in the 1880s, President Porfirio Diaz made repeated overtures to attract Jewish refugees fleeing Imperial Russia, but this was continually sabotaged by anti-Semitic threats from Catholic reactionaries in the press. On top of that, Diaz's own economic policies had only served to exacerbate wealth inequality. The real wages of working-class Mexicans were actually falling. Why would working-class Jewish immigrants bother with these conditions when they could just as easily live far better in the United States? Only with the dawn of a new century did Jewish immigration begin to pick up, mostly from Ottoman Syria and the Balkans. Almost immediately, these immigrants began planting the seeds of communal institutions like private schools and mutual aid societies. But before anything else could happen, Mexico descended into revolution, resulting in a decade-long multipolar civil war with constantly shifting alliances, 2 U.S. interventions, and a revolving door of regime change. At least 10% of Mexico's population was killed. I've talked a fair amount about revolutions on this channel, but Jewish involvement in this one was pretty minimal. Jewish emancipation was not at all in question. The Jewish population was still very small, and the war never produced any notable Jewish figures, with one possible exception that we'll talk about later. Far more important to the Jewish story was how the revolution ended. Emerging from a decade of horrific conflict, the new center-left government of President Álvaro Obregón sought to address the systemic issues that had provoked the revolution in the first place. For its entire history up to this point, Mexico had been a mostly rural society dominated by a disenfranchised rural peasantry. What little industry existed was mostly extractive, controlled by a small technocratic elite and over-dependent on foreign investment. Looking to the US as an example, one of Obregón's solutions was to establish a large urban working class by encouraging mass immigration. But unlike in the US, new arrivals were required to renounce their foreign citizenships in order to own property, and even then weren't allowed to own property along coasts or international borders, helping to keep the new arrivals and the GDP that they generated from leaving the country. By coincidence, the US during Obregon's presidency ended its own mass immigration policy, forcing most prospective immigrants from Europe and West Asia to seek out alternative destinations, including Mexico. Even then, Mexico was never a top prospect, and the foreign-born population there never reached the percentages seen in pre-war America. But it was a huge boon to Mexico's economic recovery, and as this recovery drew international attention, immigration, including Jewish immigration, steadily increased. With the end of mass Jewish immigration to the United States, Jewish communal organizations north of the border began taking a more active interest in the well-being of Mexican Jews, inspiring Obregon's successor Plutarco Elias Calles to publicly reaffirm his government's openness to Jewish immigration in 1924. The American response was surprisingly cold. By this time, Britain and the League of Nations had established a right of return for Jews in Palestine, which consequently diverted most of these groups' philanthropic efforts, all but killed the Jewish territorialist movement, and kept the rate of immigration low. According to essayist Salomon Khan, himself a Jewish immigrant to Mexico, these arrivals had already peaked by the mid-1920s and numbered well under 20,000 across the entire interwar period. Nevertheless, this was the most significant period of Jewish immigration to Mexico. The majority settled in Mexico City and largely self-sorted along linguistic lines: Arabic speakers from Syria, Ladino speakers from the Balkans, and Yiddish speakers from the former Russian Empire, each with a robust media ecosystem that kept these languages alive for the next generation. In the first few years after the revolution, the majority of Jewish immigrant workers worked as street peddlers, but by the mid-1920s, Jewish employment had shifted much more toward light industry and retail, mostly in the clothing industry on the east side of central Mexico City. And while American Jewish philanthropic organizations had lost interest in Jewish immigration to Mexico, they maintained an active role developing communal institutions for Jews already living there. Accordingly, the 1920s saw the establishment of the Young Men's and Women's Hebrew Associations, local branches of B'nai B'rith, Po'al Etzion, and Sephardic Bikur Cholim, the first of several Jewish private schools, and several newspapers, most notably the Yiddish daily Der Weg. As early as 1923, Mexico had its first Jewish governor, Vicente Lombardo. This was the period that produced many of Mexico's foremost Jewish cultural figures, including anthropologist Anita Brenner and the Yiddish poets Jacobo Glanz and Isaac Berliner. Of course, no discussion of interwar Mexican art would be complete without mentioning the legendary muralist Diego Rivera, who, upon learning of some distant Converso ancestry, didn't so much convert to Judaism as adopt secular Jewishness as a guiding principle, becoming friends with many Jewish artists, in particular Isaac Berliner and Amedeo Modigliani. And toward the end of the decade, the government's defeat of the conservative Cristero rebels resulted in a lasting taboo against religion in politics, which further expanded social opportunities for Mexican Jews. By the decade's end, modestly sized Jewish communities in Guadalajara, Monterrey, and Puebla had begun establishing their own institutions, but the majority remained in Mexico City. And as the working population transitioned from peddlers to skilled artisans, Jews working in El Centro began moving to the newer, more middle-class developments of Roma and La Condesa, where you can still find active synagogues, the Jewish Documentation Center where I did much of the research for this video, and a number of Jewish restaurants and bars. I'm eating this in the park because I was not waiting for a table there. Like fun was I waiting for a table there. Ironically, Mexican Jewry's upward mobility and growing social acceptance inspired a severe backlash from within the middle class, who increasingly feared for their privileged status. Accordingly, the 1930s would be the most anti-Semitic period in the history of the Mexican state. I hope you're enjoying the video so far, and if you're particularly enjoying the detailed maps of Mexico that I've shown, you can thank OmniAtlas. OmniAtlas is a company based in New Zealand that I've been working with since 2013, many years before starting this channel. And when I started making videos about Jewish history, my first instinct was to see if OmniAtlas would let me use their maps and map templates. Obviously they did, and OmniAtlas has just been a huge leg up on my production process from day one. Go check their link in the description if you're interested. And now, on with the show. Anti-Semitism isn't a coherent ideology. While there are some common tropes and beliefs, it adapts to the specific anxieties of the states in which it takes root. Russian anti-Semitism is historically tied to opposition to democracy. American anti-Semitism is very preoccupied with sex and sexuality, and Mexican anti-Semitism is generally bound up in anti-Asian sentiment. Since the 1880s, there have been furtive xenophobic outbursts against Mexicans of East Asian descent, peaking in 1911 when revolutionaries massacred 300 Chinese immigrants in the city of Torreon. However, the rising status of post-revolutionary immigrants from Eastern Europe and West Asia brought renewed attention to the ways the country was changing, and threatened the singular status of the pre-revolutionary middle class, leading to an increasingly organized anti-Asian political force targeting Arabs, Turks, Armenians, Japanese, and most especially Chinese and Jewish Mexicans. These shifting attitudes even led to a change in immigration laws to prevent such people from continuing to immigrate, and as a result, only about 2,000 Jews were able to obtain residency between 1933 and 1945. But for most of these ultranationalists, restricting immigration was only a stepping stone to expelling all so-called undesirables in defense of what they called la raza, the supposed political superiority of mixed white and indigenous ancestry. With the onset of the Great Depression, these ultranationalists formed the National League Against Chinese and Jewish Penetration in order to organize mass boycotts against businesses and champion discriminatory bills in Congress. Just as in Canada and the United States, the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany inspired many more Mexican fascist organizations, gradually forming a broad coalition of the National League, a fascist veteran militia called the Gold Shirts, and the mixed-race nationalist Pro-Raza Committee, who in May 1931 successfully expelled 250 Jewish merchants from the La Lagunita market in northern Mexico City. But by this time, the post-revolutionary Laborist Party had reorganized into the National Revolutionary Party, adopting an orientation that was socialist but still broadly pro-Western. This was the same government supporting the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War, giving refuge to Leon Trotsky, condemning the Anschluss more forcefully and unequivocally than any other nation. They weren't interested in this kind of politics, and they weren't about to stop ordinary citizens from taking a stand. In 1935, on the 25th anniversary of the revolution, the Gold Shirts took it upon themselves to parade around the Zócalo, the central square in front of the presidential offices and cathedral. While some fascist groups made at least some pretense of being pro-worker, the Gold Shirts were unapologetically just a gang, comprising ex-military Nazi sympathizers who made a living by breaking up labor strikes and exacting protection rackets on farmers, university students, and Jewish and Chinese business owners. In short, they'd made enemies of almost everyone, and at the end of the day's festivities, they suddenly found themselves outnumbered by more than 10-1 by an anti-fascist coalition comprising the Mexican Communist Party, an automotive workers' union, and a coalition of socialist self-defense groups. The ensuing riot resulted in the deaths of 3 fascists and 2 communists, led to a new law banning the Gold Shirts as a political organization, and inspired the consolidation of most trade unions into the Confederation of Mexican Workers, under former Puebla governor Vicente Lombardo. Driven underground, Mexico's various fascist groups joined forces with German Mexican organizers who sympathized with the Nazis directly and rallied around former cabinet secretary Saturnino Cedillo, who'd broken with President Lázaro Cárdenas over secularization and collectivized farming. Despite an armament that even included some airplanes, the Cedillistas never numbered more than a few hundred insurgents concentrated in Cedillo's home state of San Luis Potosí. In March 1938, the government declared the Cedillistas to be in rebellion, and any threat they still posed was crushed when government forces killed Cedillo in January 1939. The last major fascist action in Mexico occurred later that month with an inept pogrom against Jewish businesses in Mexico City, having utterly failed to win public sympathy or break into mainstream politics. That isn't to say that Mexico had been purged of Nazi influence. For all its anti-fascist positioning, Mexico remained neutral through the first half of the Second World War, and, like many other countries opposed to the Nazis in spirit, still generally refused entry to Jewish refugees fleeing the Holocaust. And there's evidence to suggest that German moles in the Mexican government played a role. However, these machinations were ignored by Gilberto Bosques, the Mexican consul in Marseille. When the war began, Bosques had been active in providing Mexican visas to Republican exiles from the Spanish Civil War, but he'd also become sympathetic to the similar position of Europe's Jews. By maintaining the fiction of an independent, neutral country, the German puppet regime of Vichy France had become a last refuge for Jews who had successfully evaded the German invasions of Europe. Bosques did all he could to issue Mexican visas, but was severely limited by an obstinately nativistic government back home. Ultimately, repeated U-boat attacks on Mexican oil tankers finally prompted Mexico to join the war in 1942, permanently delegitimizing any fascist sympathies in the country. In 1951, Salomon Khan wrote that Jews had become fully integrated into Mexican society. Post-war, Jews experienced further upward mobility and a baby boom, establishing their current population centers in the affluent borough of Miguel Hidalgo and the neighboring suburbs just over the border in Mexico State, as well as the old neighborhoods of Roma and La Condesa. Whereas the pre-war population had primarily worked in the garment industry, their children were much more likely to seek out higher education and work in professions like law and medicine. The same period has seen a surprisingly large amount of Jewish immigration across the US-Mexico border, in both directions. Because of its proximity, cultural similarities, and comparatively low cost of living, Mexico City has been a common destination for American retirees and white-collar professionals. Even in 1961, the first conservative synagogue in Mexico was founded by American expatriates living in the affluent Polanco neighborhood. At the same time, it's historically been common for Mexican Jews to attend universities in the United States and later obtain permanent residency. The epicenter of this phenomenon is West Hills, California, where Spanish-speaking Jews make up about a third of the population. Prior to the war, Salomon Khan remarked that most Mexican Jews were reticent to run for public office for fear of provoking an anti-Semitic backlash, instead limiting their political activity to voting, activism, and trade unionism. But after the war, that began to change, and with upward mobility and a broader shift toward the center, the political orientation of the Jewish community also became more conservative. In fact, I would argue that the political orientation of the Jewish community is a misnomer. For most of the 20th century, Mexico was a de facto single-party state under what eventually came to be known as the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI. Other parties certainly existed, but always at a permanent disadvantage, so major political shifts took place within the party. On top of all that, the PRI aggressively promoted an image of Mexico as a post-racial society. The exact degree to which that was true depended on which ethnic group you belonged to. But if Khan is to be believed, Jews in the mid-20th century experienced less discrimination in Mexico than even in the US. And as a result, Mexican Jewry never needed to organize themselves politically as Jews. In turn, anti-Semitism hasn't played a significant role in the perception of Jewish public figures. Consider Jacobo Zabludovsky, host of Mexico's most popular TV news program from 1970 to 1998, and a man I've seen compared to Walter Cronkite in the US. Unlike Walter Cronkite, Zabludovsky is a deeply controversial figure due to his association with the pre-oligarchy. But the total lack of controversy over his being Jewish does speak to the degree to which anti-Semitism plays a vanishingly rare role in Mexican society today. This has been reinforced by Mexico's new Jewish president. As I said at the beginning of this video, the fact that Claudia Sheinbaum is Jewish didn't endear her to Jewish voters, who again tend to be more politically conservative. At the same time, while there are no specific surveys of Jewish Mexican voting habits, friend of the channel The Aztlan Historian has suggested that the margin of Jewish opposition to her candidacy was probably much narrower than the Jewish partisan divide in the United States. The conclusion that I draw from this is that Jewishness has basically no influence on one's political preferences as a voter, nor one's electability as a candidate. With all that in mind, it's not surprising that Mexico elected a Jewish president before the United States. But politics is one thing. History as a standalone discipline tends to overemphasize politics at the cost of everything else. And despite having a Jewish president, there are currently no Jewish governors, senators, or deputies. In any case, there's another area of Mexican society in which the Jewish community has played a much more significant role. In 1906, a Jewish immigrant named Jacobo Granat established the Salón Rojo, Mexico's first movie theater, which went on to become a major hangout spot for Francisco Madero, soon to serve as leader of the Mexican Revolution and then president until his assassination in 1913. Granat left the country heartbroken over Madero's murder, but after the revolution, the Salón Rojo was reopened and renamed the Cine Granat in his honor. The post-revolutionary wave of Jewish immigration coincided with the flowering of cinema as a global art form, and it wasn't uncommon for Jewish filmmakers abroad to visit Mexico in the course of their work. In 1931, in spite of government efforts to stop Jewish immigration, actor and filmmaker Arkady Beutler moved to Mexico from the US to become a foundational figure in the country's domestic film industry, followed by a number of production companies working in both film and television, which has spawned an impressively large number of Jewish directors, screenwriters, producers, and actors right up to the present day. One who particularly stood out to me was Wolf Ruvinskis, an immigrant from Argentina who first visited Mexico while on tour as a pro wrestler, ended up staying permanently, and became one of the most prolific leading men in the country. At the same time, a lot of Jews in Mexico's film industry have crossed over into Hollywood. Some you may even have heard of, like three-time Oscar-winning cinematographer Emmanuel Lubezki, or the father and son team of Alexander and Ilya Salkind, who brought Superman to the big screen in 1978. And ironically, while their Jewish identity tends to go unnoticed in Mexico, their Mexican identity tends to go unnoticed in the US. As of the 2020 census, Mexico has a Jewish population of 58,876, mostly in and around Mexico City, making it the 13th largest Jewish population in the world, the 5th largest in the Americas, and the 2nd largest of any Spanish-speaking country. This is a larger Jewish population than Ukraine or Italy. Mexican Jews have a massive cultural influence that extends well beyond the country's borders, and one of them is the current president. So why isn't any of this better known? The main reason seems to be that Mexico itself doesn't have a great track record of documenting and teaching its own recent history, especially when it comes to highlighting specific ethnic minorities under a political order that at least pretends not to see race. Compare that with the US and Canada, which have historically highlighted their multiculturalism and immigrant roots. There's also a language barrier. Fewer than 500,000 Jews speak Spanish as their first language, and most of them live in Argentina, a country not exactly known for sharing the spotlight. On top of that, you have the typical difficulties of teaching Jewish history that helped inspire this channel, as well as the way that American and Canadian society have tended to exoticize Mexico for political reasons, when in reality, it's far more civilizationally North American than it gets credit for. And that's really why I made this video now, because now you know, and hopefully, this community will finally get the recognition it deserves.
In case you're wondering, this officially counts as a business expense. L'chaim.
Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, FC, Matthew Feinberg, Jay Fleischman, Oshar Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Sol Cohn, Jacob Kossoff, and Jeffrey Schweitzer.